90,000 people were in that stadium the night Michael Jackson saw something that made him stop the greatest show on earth. The question is, who was lying on that stretcher at the edge of the stage, and why does what happened next still bring people to tears decades later? It was July 16, 1988, Wembley Stadium, London. The Bad World Tour was at its absolute peak. 504 sold-out shows across the globe, and this night in London was the crown jewel. In the royal box sat Princess Diana and Prince Charles. On the field, 90,000 fans were pressed together so tightly that the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Michael Jackson was 29 years old. He had just released Bad, an album that produced 5 consecutive #1 singles. The Thriller era had already made him the most famous human being on the planet, and now, on this summer evening, at the most iconic stadium in the world, with royalty watching from the stands, he was about to deliver what many would later call the greatest concert performance of his life. But something was different about that night. Something that had nothing to do with the lights, the choreography, or the 90,000 screaming fans. It started hours before the show. That afternoon, while his band was doing sound checks and his crew was running final technical rehearsals, Michael Jackson quietly left the stadium. No announcement, no cameras. His security team knew where he was going. They always did on nights like this, because this was not unusual for Michael Jackson. This was a ritual. He went to the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. For those who don't know, Great Ormond Street is one of the most famous children's hospitals in Britain, a place where the most critically ill children in Britain receive treatment. Some of them have conditions so severe that their families have been told to prepare for the worst. Some of them will never leave. Michael Jackson walked through those halls for hours. He sat on the edge of beds. He held small hands. He told stories to children who were too weak to sit up. A 4-year-old girl named Joanne, who had just had a throat operation and was breathing through a special tube, managed to look up at him and whisper one word: "Thriller." Michael laughed, genuinely, fully, and held her hand for a long time. A 9-year-old boy named Neil had recently survived surgery to remove a brain tumor. He wasn't even scheduled to meet Michael that day, but somehow word reached Jackson that Neil was in a room just down the hall. He walked in unannounced, sat down next to the boy's bed, and stayed. Neil's father stood in the doorway, unable to speak. He later said that his son had been withdrawn and frightened for weeks, and that Michael's visit was the first time he had seen his boy smile since the surgery. Michael Jackson donated £100,000 to Great Ormond Street that day. Not for press coverage. There were no cameras inside those rooms. He had specifically asked that the hospital visits remain private. Then he went back to Wembley Stadium and got ready to perform for 90,000 people. The show that night was extraordinary by any measure. Michael opened with "Wanna Be Startin' Something," and within 60 seconds the entire stadium was a single living, breathing organism. Songs like Thriller, Billie Jean, and Dirty Diana transformed the stadium into something that felt less like a concert and more like a religious event. Princess Diana was seen clapping along, visibly moved. Prince Charles leaned to her and said something. She smiled. But what happened near the end of the show is what this story is really about, because Michael Jackson's team had arranged something that night, something that had become a quiet tradition on this tour, a tradition that almost none of the 90,000 people in the stadium knew was happening. A small group of children from Great Ormond Street had been brought to the concert. They arrived in wheelchairs and on stretchers. Some wore hospital bracelets still attached to their wrists. They were positioned carefully at the edge of the stage, close enough to see everything, close enough for Michael to see them. One of them was a 7-year-old boy named James. James had leukemia. He had been in treatment for almost 2 years. His mother, Sarah, had spent so many nights in the hospital chair beside his bed that the nurses had started leaving a blanket out for her. James had good days and bad days, but recently the bad days had started outnumbering the good ones. His doctors had spoken to Sarah in the quiet, careful way that doctors speak when they want to prepare a parent for something they don't want to hear.
James had one request. He had asked for it so many times that Sarah had stopped writing it down. He wanted to see Michael Jackson. Not a poster, not a video on television. He wanted to be in the same space as the man whose music played from the small cassette player on his hospital nightstand every single morning. The song was always the same, Ben, the English version of a gentle ballad Michael had recorded as a child about loyalty and unconditional love. James didn't fully understand why that song made him feel safe. He just knew that it did. And now, on a summer night in London, he was lying on a stretcher at the edge of the Wembley stage while 90,000 people roared around him. Midway through the concert, Michael Jackson moved to the front of the stage for a slower section of the set. The lights dropped, the screaming softened into something closer to reverence, and that is when Michael saw the stretchers. He had seen this before. He had arranged it himself night after night on this tour, but something about this particular moment stopped him. He walked to the very edge of the stage and looked down. James looked up. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. The most famous person in the world and a 7-year-old boy with a hospital bracelet on his wrist. The noise of 90,000 people seemed to recede. Michael Jackson's vocal coach, Seth Riggs, who was watching from the side of the stage, later said he had seen Michael perform hundreds of times, but he had never seen him go still like that, just completely, utterly still. Then Michael crouched down at the edge of the stage and spoke directly to James. No microphone, no amplification, just a man getting as close as the height of the stage would allow to a child lying on a stretcher below him. What he said in that moment only James and Sarah heard. Sarah later described it simply, "He told my son that he was the bravest person in that stadium, that every song tonight was for him." Then Michael Jackson stood up, turned back to the crowd, and began to sing "She's Out of My Life," a ballad so tender, so exposed that it was the one song in his catalog where his voice would sometimes actually break with emotion mid-performance. That night, it broke. It broke completely, and 90,000 people, most of whom had no idea what had just happened at the edge of the stage, felt it anyway. They felt the shift in the room. They felt that something true was happening, something that had nothing to do with choreography or lighting or spectacle. Parents in the crowd held their children tighter without knowing why. Grown men who had come to see a pop concert found themselves unable to explain the feeling in their chests. After the show, Michael spent time backstage with James and the other children from the hospital. He signed photographs. He gave James one of the white sequined gloves, the real one from the performance. He sat on the floor next to the stretcher so that he and James were at the same level. James wore that glove on the ride back to the hospital. He wore it the next morning, too. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in James's condition. Whether it was coincidence or the strange biochemistry of joy or simply the will of a child who had been given a reason to hold on, his doctors began to notice small changes. He was more alert. He was eating again. He was asking for his cassette player. He lived for another 14 months. Sarah said that in those 14 months, James talked about that night almost every day. Not about the spectacle of it, not about the 90,000 people or the pyrotechnics or the dancing. He talked about the moment Michael crouched at the edge of the stage and spoke to him directly. He talked about being seen. He told me, Sarah said years later, that Michael made him feel like he was the only person there. Michael Jackson performed 504 shows on the Bad World Tour. At nearly every stop, children from local hospitals were brought backstage or to the front of the stage. It was not publicized. It was not part of the official tour press. Jackson's vocal coach, Seth Riggs, who witnessed it night after night, put it plainly. Every night the kids would come in on stretchers, so sick they could barely hold their heads up, and Michael would get down on the floor next to them. Every single night. In 1988, before leaving London, Michael Jackson also donated the equivalent of over $400,000 split between the Prince's Trust and Great Ormond Street Hospital, handed directly to Prince Charles and Princess Diana at the stadium. He went on to donate an estimated $500 million to charity over the course of his life. He supported 39 different charitable organizations, a number that earned him a Guinness World Record. In 1992, he founded the Heal the World Foundation and donated the entire revenue of his Dangerous World Tour to it. Most of it he did quietly. Most of it the world never saw. The night in Wembley in 1988 is remembered by music historians as one of the greatest live performances ever captured on film. The footage has been watched hundreds of millions of times. Critics write about the choreography, the production, the sheer scale of the thing. But somewhere in that footage, if you know where to look, there is a brief moment where Michael Jackson walks to the very front of the stage and goes still, where the noise of 90,000 people seems to hold its breath, where the king of pop disappears for just a second, and what's left is just a man looking down at a child, making him feel like he was the only person in the world. That is the moment this story is really about. Not the lights, not the moonwalk, not the records or the awards or the sold-out stadiums. The moment a man at the absolute peak of his fame chose to see one child in a crowd of 90,000 and made sure that child knew he was seen. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful thing any of us can do is stop and pay attention to the person right in front of us. Subscribe for more stories about the human beings behind the legends. And leave a comment below. What is the one Michael Jackson song that has stayed with you your whole life?